Afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Laura, for putting this symposium together. It's been really great hearing all your talks. This talk was supposed to be presented by Yuqi Chen from my group, but he couldn't make it to the conference, so I'll be presenting on his behalf. And also thank my co-speakers for covering most of the concepts, which makes it a bit easier for me to present this. So the question really is, why study brain aging in depression? Now, I'll take you back to this work which we did almost a decade ago, where we looked at this cohort of about 100 depressed patients and 74 healthy controls, and the analysis was to compare gray matter volumes and cortical thickness between the two cohorts. And what was striking was we saw quite widespread changes in volume, mainly volume loss in depression, and also cortical thinning with cortical thickness measures. And at the time, we were trying to interpret what this loss would mean. And the obvious thing to do was to compare it to age change with normal aging, volume change with normal aging. So we came up with this metric called change in volume expected to normal aging. And we used an independent cohort of 476 patients who were scanned on the same scanner. And we used these clusters to map the normative trajectories across the lifespan. So it was, there was data from 18 to almost 80 years old cohort. And what was interesting was and this is really average loss and very crude way of looking at this metric, but the loss was almost equivalent to 14 years of normal aging. And you've heard today the more sophisticated ways of looking at brain age and brain pad, which is a metric which computes the brain predicted age compared to the chronological age. And there's also normative modeling, which allows you to capture deviations at the regional level and even at the individual level. So these are more sophisticated ways of trying to understand how the brain might be aging in across psychiatric conditions. So the goals for this talk was really to map out if either of these metrics are associated with treatment response in depression. And more interestingly, in the context of our study, we were interested in knowing if there's a way to use these metrics to differentiate between various first-line treatments for depression. So I won't go on the global burden for depression, but one of the most significant problems in treating with depression is antidepressant medications are the first-line treatment. So typically when an individual gets diagnosed with depression, there's a 99% chance that they'll be given a script, a medication script to treat their depression. And the problem is there are various classes and types of antidepressants, but and not every antidepressant works for every individual. So research has shown that almost 50% actually do not respond to their first medication. So this sets patients and the clinicians on a trial and error process where they trial out an antidepressant class, then they switch to another one, and so on. And the problem with this is the response rate seems to decrease with every failed attempt. So there's a real clinical need of identifying the right treatment for an individual as early as possible in treating them. So this inspired us to do this study called the International Study to Predict Optimized Treatment in Depression. And this was a global clinical trial. This was led by Professor Leanne Williams, who was at Sydney at the time and now at Stanford. And it was a global study with 20 sites across 5 countries. The target was 2,500 depressed patients, and about 10% had imaging data collected. And as you can see over here, the study design was, it was a naturalistic study, so patients were treated by their physicians or primary care providers. And the main caveat was we used 3 first-line antidepressant treatments. So these are 2 SSRIs and 1 SNRI. And each one of them is prescribed with equal probability in the clinic, so it really depends on clinician preference and really experience of which one seems to work better for their patients. So there's an equal chance that one of these first-line antidepressant is given as a treatment for patients. So the goal of the study was to use a number of different markers or measures. So we did clinical interviews, there were self-report measures, there were cognitive scores, cognitive battery, and there's physiology, EEGs, MRI, and genetics. And all these were collected prior to treatment and after treatment, with the idea being to use the prior to treatment data to see if we can predict who will be responsive to these various treatments. And obviously, another interesting part of this study was to see if we could identify non-responders prior to treatment, because if someone's not likely to respond to either of these treatments, then there are alternative second-tier or augmented treatments. So a bit of the study design. So I'm presenting only the imaging data for this cohort. So we had 250 patients. For this study, we ended up with 235 patients who had usable T1 data, structural data, after quality control and free-surf corrections. We also had a match cohort of 271 controls. Here's the design of the study. So all patients came in at baseline. They completed this whole extensive battery of testing, which took almost 6 hours in the lab. And then they were sent back to their clinicians, where they were prescribed, randomized to either of these 3 treatments, escitalopram, sertraline, or SSRIs, and then Lofexine XR is an SNRI. And then they were monitored over an 8-week period, which is typically done in the clinic. At 8 weeks, they were then categorized into either responders, if they had demonstrated at least 50% improvement in their symptoms, or categorized as remitted if they scored less than 7 on the Hamilton Depression Rating Scale. And there was also a naturalistic follow-up for a year, which I want to talk about here. So this is the sample cohort. As expected, 35% of the cohort actually achieved remission at 8 weeks. The response rate was roughly half, which is what other studies have also shown. They were fairly matched. The remission and the non-remission group were fairly matched at baseline. And as expected, the remission group improved at week 8. There were some interesting differences between the cohorts, such as age. The non-remitter group was slightly older than the remitter group. Also, the non-remitter group seemed to be more chronic. So there were less number of treatment-naive patients in the non-remission group, and they had also experienced depression for a longer period of time before entering the study. So in terms of methodology, I won't go too depth into this. We basically looked at BrainPad and normative modeling, the idea of BrainPad being to calculate the brain's biological age using the T1 MRI scan. We used the centile brain model with Gaussian process regression, which was trained on 37,000 plus controls from the Enigma lifespan data. And as I said, BrainPad was calculated as predicted brain age from the scan minus the chronological age. So a higher value in the BrainPad corresponds to an older brain, where the lower value corresponds to a younger brain. The inputs were free surfer, cortical thickness measurements, surface area, and subcortical volume. And we used robust GLMs controlling for linear and nonlinear effects of age, sex, and we also tested for interactions. With normative modeling, the goal was to identify individual levels of deviations in brain structure compared to the age-sex match norms. So this gave us z-squares for every individual and for every region. And we used multivariate fractional polynomial regression, which was optimized for nonlinear effects. And all these measures were then put in a logistic or robust regression model to identify which were the most predictive regions which distinguish controls and depression and depressed patients based on treatment outcomes. So results, these are the BrainPad results. We found in our cohort, the patients had significantly higher BrainPad than controls. So the plot on the left is healthy controls, on the right is patients. Higher the number, the older the brain, and lower the number, the younger brain. And it was a significant effect, and there were no effects of age or sex or interaction in our analysis. When comparing responders and non-responders, our results were actually quite different from what Christian presented and Christian found with his study. We found that non-responders tended to have a higher brain age as compared to responders. And again, what was interesting was the effect was independent of age and sex, but interestingly, the 3 medication types. So we saw the robust effect for all the 3 medications in the study. We also looked at remission. This was another clinical criteria for our study. And there was a trend between non-remitters and remitters, but the direction was still the same, but non-remitters tend to have an older brain than remitters. In terms of looking at brain pad associated with change in depression symptoms, so here we are looking at the change of symptoms relative to the baseline. And there was a significant negative association with higher brain age predicting poor response or poor symptom improvement, as you can see on this plot. Now for the normative data, what was interesting was, as I said, we looked at 3 different models: cortical thickness, surface area, and subcortical volume. And only the cortical thickness model was significantly different between controls and depressed. And these are some of the regions which are shown, which tend to show greater deviation between those who are depressed versus controls. The blue indicating that depressed patients had lower cortical thickness than controls. And some of the regions here are the ones we typically find with the functional pathophysiology of depression, such as the caudal ACC, parahippocampal, and postcentral gyrus. In terms of comparing responders and non-responders, or remitters and non-remitters, we found that both cortical thickness and surface area deviations were significantly different between the 2 groups. The subcortical volumes were interestingly not, which aligns with typical finding in the literature where it's been hard to replicate subcortical volume. And interestingly, again, the difference was independent of medication type, age, or sex. So the next question was really, could we replicate these results in an independent cohort? And we were lucky to have data from Chris Davey and Bren Harrison, our colleagues from Melbourne, who had conducted a study in youth depression. And this study was looking at a younger cohort from 15 to 25 years of age. And they had 2 treatment arms, CBT versus CBT with fluoxetine, which is another first-line SSRI. And the goal of the study was to evaluate if adding fluoxetine to cognitive behavioral therapy is more effective than cognitive behavioral therapy alone. And typically, cognitive behavioral therapy is the first-line treatment for younger patients with depression. Their primary outcome was MADRS after 12 weeks, and there were assessments at 4 and 8 weeks. And here you can see the difference between the cohorts. The response rate was fairly similar to what we had seen in iSpot and with the literature, and so was the remission rate. And there were no differences between age, unlike the iSpot study. What was interesting was the study actually didn't find any difference between CBT alone versus CBT with antidepressant, which is interesting. So acknowledging Isabella Bruckella from a team who conducted most of these analyses. Here again, we're looking at controls versus depression. And interestingly, we didn't find any differences between brain age in this cohort between the 2 groups. Also with response to treatment, it was a null finding. We didn't find differences between responders and non-responders, or remitters and non-remitters, or change in MADRS with the brain age matrix. Unfortunately, I don't have the normative data to present, and in interest of time, I won't talk too much about it. Again, there was no difference between the types of treatments, so CBT alone versus CBT and fluoxetine. There was no interaction with brain age. It's quite a depressing result, but anyways, the key takeaways is I think brain age is not such a low-hanging fruit as we think it might be for clinical translation. It's a lot more complex, and you sort of got the gist about it from the other talks. Although in our iSpot study, we saw some promising promising results in which brain age prior to treatment was associated with poor treatment outcomes, and also normative modeling seemed to be linked to treatment non-response. And the findings were consistent across the three types of medications used in the study. Although the caveat is none of these replicated in the YODA-C study. And there are a few reasons for it, possibly a younger cohort as compared to iSpot, which was a wider age range cohort. Also, the YODA study recruited treatment-naive patients, whereas iSpot had more chronic and partially treatment-naive patients, and also a larger sample for the iSpot, which could have contributed to that. I think with the interest of time, I'll stop there because I've gone over time, but I'm sure we're happy to take any questions. Thank you.